Okay, well, welcome back from lunch. I'm Mark Duggan, the director of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, one of the co-organizers of today's conference, and I'm really honored to play a small role in today's conference to honor the path-breaking and fundamental contributions of Ken Arrow as a scholar and his kindness and humility to those who knew him as their colleague, their advisor, their teacher, their friend, or family member. But before proceeding to an introduction, I just want to pause a bit to thank once again. First, I'd like to thank the organizers, Matt Jackson, Al Roth, and John Chauvin, for pulling together an exceptional program. I'd also like to thank once again the Hewlett Foundation and the president and provost here at Stanford for funding this great conference. And finally, I would like to thank, as you all can no doubt tell, there are a lot of people who are working hard on the logistics of today's event. I especially want to thank Ellen Moore and her team from CEPR, and also Trudy Haley and her team from economics. So please join me in thanking them. And I'm also very honored to introduce the next speaker on today's program, Robert Solow, the 1987 recipient of the Nobel Prize for his contributions to the theory and empirical analysis of economic growth. Bob is an institute professor emeritus at MIT, where he has been on the faculty since September 1949. I first got the chance to know our next speaker when I was a PhD student at MIT, not in economics actually, but in electrical engineering more than 20 years ago. At the time, I had been losing interest in my engineering studies, and so I started bouncing around to explore courses in other departments at MIT. I heard some excitement about an up-and-coming professor teaching a macroeconomics course, and it happened to fit into my schedule, so I decided to sit in on the class. From Professor Solow's very first lecture, I was captivated by the material, its quantitative nature, and the practical importance of the topics. I met with him a few times during his office hours that semester, and he helped to connect me to a research project that I ultimately ended up somehow using for my engineering master's thesis. And it is because of that course with Professor Solow and the time that he took with me when I was a random electrical engineering PhD student that I essentially switched from electrical engineering into economics. And so I am, really, I can't tell you how delighted and honored I am 24 years after meeting him in a lecture hall at MIT to introduce you to Robert Solow to hear his own reflections, both personal and professional, about Ken Arrow.
Thanks for that. I'm going to sit here rather than try to stand up. Thanks for that, Mark. Nothing pleases me more than to have recruited an engineer into economics. We'll change MIT yet one of these days. Well, this is going to be a change of pace. You will see. I first met Kenneth in the summer of 1951, or more to the point, Ken and Selma and Bobby and I became friends in the summer of 1951. That's a long time ago. That's 66 years. I'm the last survivor of that friendship, but the friendship is old enough to be drawing Social Security. Keep that in mind. We were together because we were both spending the summer of 1951 at the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica. Ken already had a relationship with the Rand Corporation. In fact, I have a distinct memory that the first printed version of Social Choice and Individual Values was as a Rand paper, and it only came to whoever published the final version later. So we were at Rand for the summer, and I'm going to talk later about the project that we were engaged in. We were engaged in a common project, and I'm going to do that because I want you to know that I'm a serious person, and it will reveal something about Kenneth as an economist and a person. But before I do that, I just cannot resist the temptation to reminisce for a while, to free associate. And since we've just finished lunch, I'm going to free associate about meals that we had. For instance, in that summer of 1951, the four of us, Ken and Selma and Bobby and I, decided to have dinner at what was then the Inn restaurant in Los Angeles. It was called Chasen's, or Dave Chasen's, and it was where movie people and celebrities went to have dinner. Well, we knew we were sort of out of our element when we drove into the parking lot. The restaurant had its own parking lot in the Arrow's blue Studebaker, which was the only non-Cadillac, non-Lincoln in the whole parking lot. We counted. It was the only one. And the management must have noticed this too, because when we got into the restaurant, we were put at a corner table somewhere in Santa Barbara County, I think, and the waiter came over and suggested that we order the spaghetti, which was the cheapest item on the menu. But we didn't, because Bobby and Selma decided that we would eat a real meal, and they warned Kenneth and me to order, as we ordered, to look as if we could afford it. So, well, we tried. It was a good meal. The next chance we had to spend any length of time together was in 1957-58, when I was a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences up on Junipero Cerro, where I presume it still is, or some remnant of it still is. And Kenneth was in the department here, and he came up to the center often for lunch, and we hung out a lot together, the four of us. We played bridge, we hung out, we met the Arrow's friends, and one night we drove into San Francisco to have dinner at an Indian restaurant. And it was a nice Indian restaurant, and they gave us a nice, respectable table, and it was near a wall, and the wall had a floor-to-ceiling beaded curtain. You know the sort of thing I mean? Strings of beads, many of them, this beaded curtain hiding some kind of niche. We didn't know what. We paid no attention to that. So we were looking at the menu and deciding what to order. We had thought we'd order a bunch of dishes and share them family style. And there was one item on the menu that intrigued us a lot. It sounded very interesting, but it did say that it was highly spicy. And we thought about it, and finally we decided to order it when the beaded curtain parted, and a head with a turban on top and a beard on the bottom, this head came out of the beaded curtain and said, "I wouldn't if I were you." So we didn't. I thought that was probably a smart decision. Then, as I think about this, free associating more or less, I remember a couple of years later, another dinner, the four of us, in Paris, in a restaurant in the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is where people like us went in those days. I can't imagine it was a coincidence. I think probably there was a European meeting of the Econometric Society or something like that. Anyhow, we were having this very nice dinner, and the only thing I remember about it is that Selma told us that a year or two before, she and Kenneth had dined in this same restaurant with Ian and Dobbs Little. Now, I don't know if the name Ian Little rings any bells with this group, if you remember who it was. Jim Merles, of course, remembers, because Little and Merles wrote a celebrated monograph on project evaluation in developing countries, which was maybe the first serious attempt to use shadow pricing in public decision-making. But anyhow, the Arrows and the Littles oh, I should also mention, for those of you who don't know, that Ian Little was the author of a much-discussed book on welfare economics at the time, called, I think, A Critique of Welfare Economics, which tried to discuss in some detail the ethical and economic presuppositions of standard welfare economics. So he and Kenneth would have had a lot to talk about. I should also mention that Ian Little, who's an Oxford economist, came from a good family, not aristocracy, but a military family, as I'm pretty sure I remember. I think his father and at least one of his uncles were high military officers. Perhaps at least one of them was a general. But anyhow, according to Selma, Kenneth was quizzing Ian Little about whether he thought he could distinguish if someone was a gentleman just from watching his bodily movements. No accents, no language, nothing of that kind, just from watching him. And after some reflection, Ian Little said, well, yes, he had a very hesitant manner of speech. Yes, he thought he could probably tell a person was a gentleman from the way he handled his knife and fork at dinner. And at that moment, Kenneth spilled his soup all over the table, thus establishing his social status, at least beyond any shadow of a doubt. Well, there are other meals I could talk about, but there's just one more I want to mention, and that is that the last time I saw Kenneth was about a year ago, in November of last year. We were both in New York City. David will remember this. We were both in New York City, and we arranged to have lunch at an old-fashioned delicatessen on the Upper West Side. I think it was called Barney Greenglass on Amsterdam Avenue, around 86th Street, something like that. To be honest, I was shocked when I saw Kenneth and how physically diminished he was. He was walking with a stick, which is getting more common among my friends, and very bent over. But as soon as we were sitting at a table in that delicatessen and eating our smoked fish, he had sable, I had whitefish. As soon as we were eating and talking about economics, it was like old times. He was still bubbling over with ideas. Something about utility functions that were not individualistic, not self-regarding, and some systematic way of handling them. And for an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half, we had just a wonderful conversation about economics after we finished with family, just like old times. And then when we were finished, we went and sat by the door waiting for David to come and pick up Kenneth. And I discovered that this delicatessen sold halva in bulk. And it turned out that Kenneth, I'd never known this, is the only non-Israeli of my acquaintance who liked halva. And I love halva. Well, I didn't know, Anita, I didn't know. So I went and I bought a quarter of a pound of halva, and we sat there in two chairs near the exit, munching on the halva and enjoying our company a lot. I thought there just wasn't enough this is an academic tribute to Kenneth, after all, I grant, but there wasn't enough of what a lovely person he was, what lovely people they were, Kenneth and Selma, and how much good company they could be, playing bridge or just chatting or eating a meal somewhere. Now to come back to the Rand Corporation in the summer of '51. This is a side of Kenneth that's really quite different from anything that's been talked about so far or likely to be talked about later. The Rand Corporation was interested in static Leontief input-output models, presumably because they wanted the Rand people, who were originally established by the Air Force, were interested in being able to think about the impact of a large mobilization program, of a large program of military expenditures on the economy as a whole. Now, you can regard an input-output analysis as a way of passing from a vector of final demands of goods and services, the outputs of the industries, to the total output of those industries that's necessary to support the final demands and the intermediate inputs into those final demands and the intermediate inputs into those intermediate inputs and so on ad inf. So that's presumably what Rand was interested in, was being able to say, suppose we varied the vector of final demands to allow for a much larger military expenditure program. Would that be feasible in terms of the industry outputs that would be required, or what would those look like? The Bureau of Labor Statistics had produced an input-output table for 1947. This was 1951. For 1947, at vast expense for those times. It costs a lot to do that input-output table, maybe 50 or 60 industries. So it was a matrix of 60 rows and 60 columns, or 50 rows and 50 columns. It happens that a year or so earlier, Selma Arrow, I don't know how many of you know that Selma started off as an economist before she decided to turn to psychotherapy as a career. Selma had written a paper for the Rand Corporation in which she used the 1947 input-output table and applied it, I don't remember the exact year, but let's say to the 1949 vector of final demands, generated the implied industry outputs, and compared them with the actual industry outputs in 1949, and they were very different. There were very big errors in this use of the 1947 input-output table. And Rand wanted to know, was there some way, some relatively cheap way, of jiggering things to make it possible to use the 1947 input-output table with arbitrary vectors of final demand to get reasonable estimates of the implied industry outputs. Well, we thought about that for the whole summer and played around with it. It's obvious there's no hope trying to adjust the input-output coefficients themselves. In a 50 industry table, there are 2,500 input-output coefficients, and even if half of them are a priori zero, that's still more than 1,000 coefficients, and the data weren't available. The BLS had to work like dogs to produce that input-output table. So we conceived the idea, this is Kenneth and me, we conceived the idea that what we might do is do what Selma had done, but do it for a string of years, for several years. Get a time series of the errors, and then see if we could regress those errors on some collection of macroeconomic variables. So instead of adjusting the input-output coefficients, we try to adjust the errors. It was the closest to a reasonable device that we could think of at the time. Well, at that point, I went back to the East Coast, but Kenneth, of course, was still here, and an enterprise started at RAND to try to carry out this program, and Kenneth stayed more or less on top of it and sort of in charge of it. Marvin Hoffenberg, who was an economist at the Bureau of Labor Statistics who had worked on that input-output table, came to RAND and did the number crunching, but Kenneth was sort of in charge. And me, I irresponsibly, I answered letters. Letters, can you believe that? Letters. I answered letters, and we discussed this sort of thing. But really, Kenneth was the person who was running this. Well, this enterprise failed. This turned out to be not a good idea. The time series we had was relatively short. The various time series we had were very relatively short. We tried, or they tried, well, I guess we tried, doing the standard sorts of regressions to see if we could adjust away those errors, understand those errors. And as what typically happens with that kind of failed econometric exercise, all of these regression equations had pretty good R-squares. They ranged from, as I remember, from 0.65 to about 0.85. However, as happens with these failed econometric projects, none of the regression coefficients was statistically significant, and what was worse, none of them was interpretable. You couldn't make sense of them. They had varying signs with no apparent rationale. This just was a failed project. And I wanted to tell you this in detail because that's not the way you think of Ken Arrow, is it? You don't think of Kenneth as being in charge of a failing econometric enterprise. I mean, no word in that sentence makes any sense. And what I want to tell you is that when he came to write it up, and it was written up and published in a book by North Holland, I think called Time Series Analysis of Inter-Industry Relations, something like that, he did just a lovely job. He knew it wasn't working, it had failed. He didn't, for an instant, try to cover it up or cherry pick a result here, a result there, to make it look better than it was. He explained why we did what we did, explained what we did and why we did what we did, and some possible reasons why it wasn't working, and so he did just a job full of intelligence and integrity in writing up this failed project. And I think the lesson that you learn from this is that in spite of what we hear in the sessions, the technical sessions here, Kenneth was not a Superman. He could not, with some brilliant insight out of his head, make a success out of a failed project. That wasn't Kenneth at all. What he was an economist just like you and me, only he was smarter. He was much smarter. He was very much smarter. Thank you. Yeah.